Good afternoon, and welcome to today's seminar. My name is Cindy DeWolf, and I'm with the Division of Air Pollution Control here at Ohio EPA, and I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon. We are going to be starting Air Permitting for Major Sources Part 2, and it's part of Ohio EPA's 2020 Virtual Assistance Conference. These webinars will occur over a 3-week period from September 21st through October 8th. Please visit our conference webpage for more information about the sessions you've missed and to register for our upcoming sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate in today's event. On this slide, you'll see a screenshot of an example of an attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. For this webinar, you are listening in using your computer audio. If you are having any sound issues, please check your computer's audio settings. You may want to try refreshing your browser or logging off the session and logging back in. Please feel free to submit questions to today's presenters by typing questions into the questions pane of your control panel. You may send your questions in at any time. We have Tim Fisher, who is the District Office Manager of the Northeast District Office, and Ben Halton, who is the Lead Permit Specialist for Central District Office, behind the scenes to answer your questions. So please send them your questions. We will also collect these and address them during the question and answer session at the end of today's presentation. If we don't have time to answer your questions, the presenters will reach out to you via email, and we can assist you with your questions. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the presentation is available in the handout section of your attendee interface. Once the webinar is edited, you'll receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email along with your survey, with your session survey. The session survey will appear once the session is over. We would greatly appreciate it if you could fill it out to let us know how we're doing and to let us know if there is anything we can do to further assist you. A certificate of attendance will also be included in the email about a day or so after the session. We are happy to announce that 1 hour of registered sanitarian and sanitarian in training continuing education units have been approved for this session. If you did not enter your RS SIT number when registering for the session, please make sure you provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. Attendees seeking American Planning Association credit may do so through the APA self-reporting option. Log into your APA account and select self-reporting credit options to receive credit. If you're seeking other CEUs, check out our e-binder attached to today's webinar. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speakers. We have Bob Hodenbosey, who is the Chief of the Division of Air Pollution Control. He became Chief in 1992, and as Chief, he is responsible for Ohio's Air Pollution Control Program and the development of programs needed to comply with the Clean Air Act amendment. Prior to that time, Bob held various positions in the Division of Air Pollution Control. Bob is a member of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and the Air and Waste Management Association, and is registered as a professional engineer in the state of Ohio. Bob received his bachelor's and master's in chemical engineering from Cleveland State University. We also have Mike Hopkins, who has been with Ohio EPA since 1980. Since 2003, Mike has served as Assistant Chief for Permitting. His duties include the review and final approval of all air pollution permits to install and operate, and Title V permits in the state, along with general air pollution planning activities. Prior to becoming Assistant Chief, Mike oversaw the Air Quality Modeling and Planning section, as well as serving in our Central District Office in the Air Pollution Program as head of the Engineering section. Mike earned his bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from the Pennsylvania State University. He is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Ohio, and he is a member of the Air and Waste Management Association, the National Association of Professional Engineers, and the Ohio Society of Professional Engineers. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike Hawkins. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's presentation. What we're going to talk about this afternoon is Title V and the Title V program. And see if I've got control. There we go. The learning objectives for today is we want to kind of go through the basics of Title V air permits, teach you a little bit about what they are and what they're used for, teach you how to obtain a Title V permit. Once you have one, you may need to modify it, so we'll talk some about that. And then also learn how to apply for and obtain a renewal of the Title V permit. And last, of course, all of this stuff is kind of complex, so we also are providing information on how to get help on Title V permits. So first off, what is a Title V permit? Title V actually comes from the part of the Clean Air Act, 1990 Clean Air Act, under Title V of that act. So that's where it gets its name. It is an operating permit for air pollution sources, and it's designed for larger facilities, so the larger air pollution sources that we regulate. The Title V permit contains all of the applicable air pollution requirements that you need. So you just go to that document to find out what you need to do in terms of air pollution. It contains the emission limits, operational restrictions, monitoring requirements, testing requirements, and reporting requirements. And the Title V permit applies to the entire facility. So it contains everything for your facility from an air pollution standpoint. All right, so you need a Title V permit if you qualify as a major Title V source. And there are thresholds for determining whether or not you're a major Title V source. And those are first 100 tons per year or more of any one regulated pollutant. So PM10, particulate matter less than 10 microns, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, and lead are the regulated pollutants. And then, so if you're over 100 tons of those, or if you're over 10 tons per year of an individual hazardous air pollutant, or if you're over 25 tons per year of one or more individual hazardous air pollutants. And that's all based on potential to emit, which we'll talk about here in a second. The potential to emit means the maximum capacity to emit under a physical and operational design. So the way to think about this is if you've got a piece of equipment and it is operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you calculate what the emissions are from it for that entire period, then that would be your potential to emit for the year. It does include air pollution restrictions like air pollution control equipment and other types of restrictions if those restrictions are either federally enforceable or legally and practically enforceable by the state. This is the actual definition. You can read it at your leisure, but basically it goes through what I just discussed. So how do you actually figure out what your potential to emit is? And this can be a pretty significant effort, especially for a large facility with a lot of different pieces of equipment. And so you have to go through each piece of equipment, or emissions unit is what we call it. And you have to calculate the emissions with controls at maximum capacity for each pollutant, for each hazardous air pollutant, and for the sum of all the hazardous air pollutants. You have to look then if there are any physical or operational restrictions that apply. You also need to look to see if there are any rules that restrict emissions, because those count to limit your potential to emit. And if there are any controls, restrictions, rules, you have to check to see if they're federally enforceable or state practically enforceable, because maybe some aren't, and then it can't be used to restrict your potential to emit. But if they are, then it can be done. So you have to do that for each emissions unit. And then once you do that for each emissions unit, then you sum them all together to determine what the potential to emit is for the entire facility. There are some other triggers for Title V permitting. For instance, under the new source performance standards or the maximum achievable control technology standards, they will often have a requirement that says you have to get a Title V permit. So you need to look at those. Also, if you're an affected source, which is a defined term basically for utility boilers and those kinds of things. And then the other thing is if it's a Part 70 source, that's really where all the requirements are for the Title V permit program. Ohio has Title V rules, and those take the Part 70 and put them into the Chapter 77. And this link can get you to those actual rules if you need to get a little extra sleep tonight or something. All right, what about preparing the application? As you can imagine, if you have a facility with a lot of different sources, it can take a lot of time to both do your potential to emit calculation and then also prepare an application. So the first thing typically you have to do is prepare all of that information for your Title V application. And that time can be significant. For us, once we get a complete application, it may take us 18 months for us to process that particular permit. It can be less time, but it just depends upon a lot of different issues associated with review of that permit. Once you get a Title V permit, it lasts for 5 years. And then after that, it needs to be renewed. Submitting an application, there's no application fee. There's no permit issuance fee, so you won't get billed when you get a Title V permit for issuance of the permit. But there is a fee that's based on the amount of emissions that you produce. And so there's a program that requires you to report your emissions and then pay the fee. And that actually, the cost of those fees is tied to the Consumer Price Index. And as of 2019, it was 52.03 dollars per ton of emission. So that does adjust every year. So how do you go about applying for a Title V permit? For Title V facilities, everybody has to submit their Title V application electronically. And we have an electronic online system called Air Services that is part of Ohio EPA's e-Business Center. It's a web-based system where you are going to put in information on every one of your emissions units. It keeps that information, and then you also can submit the application through the system. So it's a very nice system to keep track of all your air pollution information and to help you submit your applications. It's all part of the e-Business Center. I've got a link here to get you to it. One of the challenges, the initial challenges, is you need a user ID and a password. This is a secure system. So you do have to go through a process in order to get a user ID and password. And it can take a little bit of time to get to that point. All right, it's time for our first quick poll. And the question is, have you ever applied for a Title V permit? And either yes or no.
Okay, we are starting the poll. It will take just a few seconds for it to show up on your screen, and then we will allow about 1 minute for responding. Okay, it looks like about 70% of the people have responded. For those of you that have not responded, go ahead and submit your responses now, and then we will close the poll. Okay, the poll is now closed. Thank you.
All right. Well, it looks pretty even in terms of the audience. 44% of you say you have applied for a Title V permit. So that's pretty impressive. That's a lot of people. But 56% say no, we haven't yet applied for a Title V permit. That's okay too. It all depends on the size of your facility. And we have a lot more facilities that are smaller facilities that don't need a Title V and get a minor source operating permit. All right. Well, what are the processing steps for getting a permit? And once we get the application, you guys, of course, go through your process of submitting the application. We typically, a field office person will get that application, will do their technical review, where they will look at any rules that apply. They'll look at emissions calculations. They'll develop any appropriate terms and conditions for the permit. And then they send that to our central office, and we do an oversight review in central office, and then the permit gets issued. And for Title V, there's actually 4 steps for issuing that kind of permit. The first is issuing a draft permit. And that draft permit is issued to gather comments from basically anybody who's interested. It could be company, it could be citizens, it could be environmental groups, it could be anybody who wants to submit some comments. After the draft permit is issued and comments are received, the next step is to issue what's called a preliminary proposed permit. And that permit incorporates the interested party comments into any changes. And then in that case, that permit is issued for the company exclusively to review and provide comments. The third step is a proposed permit, and that is for US EPA to provide comments. And then once all of that is done, then we issue a final permit. So those are the 4 steps for a standard Title V permit. All right, well, if you have a Title V permit, what does it contain? Every permit is going to list all of the applicable rules that apply to the facility as a whole or apply to different emissions units. All the emission limits that apply are going to be listed. If there are any operational restrictions for the sources, they're listed. Any monitoring requirements, reporting requirements, and testing requirements are all listed in the permit. And there's different things that end up in the permit, but they're all based in these broad categories. The permits are organized first with a cover letter, table of contents, an authorization page, and then we have what are called standard terms and conditions, which are terms and conditions that apply to every facility. They're identical for every single facility. Then we have what we call facility-wide terms and conditions, And they may be things that cover multiple emissions units. For instance, if you have a broad limit on the amount of natural gas you can use at your facility that covers all the different emissions units, then it would be in the facility-wide terms and conditions. And lastly, you get the emissions unit specific terms and conditions. And so for each piece of equipment, each emissions unit, it has a list of the requirements for that particular emissions unit. And that also is organized like the previous slide that I talked about with the rules, the emission limits, the operating restrictions, et cetera. What are some of the obligations under a Title V permit? If you're a Title V facility, you need a Title V, an effective Title V permit in order to have the legal authority to operate. So that's pretty important if you want to run your facility. You have to make sure that your sources can comply with all of the emission limits. You have to comply with all the operational restrictions. You have to do any monitoring that is required. You have to compile any records, submit any reports. You have to do any testing that is required. And then the responsible official is going to need to sign off on an annual certification of compliance, where he attests to whether or not the facility is in compliance and each of the emissions units are in compliance through that past year. And so that's where it's important for the responsible official to understand the compliance of their facility. Of course, getting a Title V is a lot of work, and if your facility is smaller and doesn't need a Title V, or if your facility is such that maybe the potential emissions are over the thresholds, but you actually operate under the thresholds, then you can get restrictions put in a permit to avoid the need to get a Title V permit. So those restrictions need to be enforceable, of course, federally enforceable or state practically enforceable. And basically what you're doing is you're adding some kind of restriction to keep you below the 100-ton threshold or whatever the threshold is. You can restrict the operating time, the materials processed, and you can reduce the emissions from the process. If you have a facility, maybe you add controls to get your emissions below the threshold, or change the processes, or change your materials. These are all techniques that can be used to reduce your potential to emit such that you can avoid the need for a Title V permit. If you do avoid a Title V permit, then you're going to get a state-based operating permit. And in Ohio, we call that a permit to install and operate. Permit to install and operate has your installation requirements and your operating requirements. And so it functions as both the installation and operating permit. You may, for PTIOs, the emissions units. It's not like the Title V permit where there's one permit that covers the entire facility. You may have multiple PTIOs that cover individual emissions units or groups of emissions units. And you may hear the term federally enforceable state operating permit or synthetic minor. Essentially, those are permits that have some kind of restriction built into them to keep you below a Title V permit or maybe some other type of rule. The disadvantage of taking this approach is that you're agreeing to these restrictions, and you can't undo those restrictions without going through some kind of permit process. So you're going to have to live with those restrictions and make sure that you can live with those restrictions without affecting your production capability and those kinds of things. All right, well, let's move on to modifying your Title V permit. And in this case, we're assuming that you have a Title V permit, that your boss comes to you and says, we got to make some changes out on the plant floor. We're going to make some other product, or we're going to do something different. And you look at your Title V permit and you say, oh, that's not going to work with my Title V permit. We need to make some changes. And so the way that works is you have to first determine what needs to change in your Title V permit. And it's a good idea to talk about these proposed changes with your district office or local air authority permit contact. They can help guide you on what you're going to need to submit, whether or not you need a permit to install first, what kind of modification type there is, because each type of modification has different obligations and differences in terms of timing, which I'll go through here next. So there's a lot that you have to kind of figure out up front when you first find out about some change that's needed for your Title V permit, so that you can move forward and figure out what you need to do. There's a bunch of different modification types, and each one is for different types of modifications for your Title V. And then each one may have a different time frame when you can actually implement those changes. So the modification types are listed here. I'm not going to go through all these. I think we have time to talk about two of these. But just so you know that each one has they're each for different requirements or different types of changes, and they have differences in terms of when they're effective. Just to give you an idea of what we see in terms of the types of modifications, this is 2014 through 2019 data. And where we issued Title V modifications, and 66% of them were minor permit modifications, 23% were administrative permit amendments, then the off permit were 6%, reopening was 2%, and significant permit mods were 3%. So most of these are relatively easy to get through the system. If you look at the previous chart, that they're a relatively easy process. But what I'm going to do is talk about the significant permit mods here in a second. But let's see with this quick poll if you've ever submitted an application to modify your Title V permit.
Okay, we are starting the poll. It takes just a few seconds for it to show up on your screen, so we will allow a minute for responding. Okay, we're at about 50% of you that have responded. So if you haven't responded, please go ahead and submit your responses, and then we'll close the poll. Okay, the poll is now closed. Thank you.
So it looks like in terms of the audience, 36% of you said yes, you've submitted a Title V modification application. 63% no, said no. And that may be pretty close in terms of the universe of facilities that we have. And in terms of numbers, we have a lot more minor non-Title V facilities than we have Title V facilities. So I would certainly expect a lot more people not to have gone through this process, depending, of course, of the mix of the audience. So that's kind of interesting and makes sense. Thanks for doing the poll. All right, well, I'm going to go through a couple of the types of modifications just to give you a sense for where they might apply and timing aspects of it. So the first one I'll talk about is the significant permit mod. This is the one that is most onerous in terms of making changes. So I wanted to include this one. And the changes for a significant permit mod apply in certain situations. So for changes for existing emissions units that are what are called emissions increase under a Title V modification, and I'll go through that in a second, or significant changes to monitoring or relaxation of reporting and record keeping terms. So that's kind of the category. When you're incorporating new units that qualify as a Title V or Title I modification, so we talked about this morning, if you were in that class, PST, Prevention of Significant Deterioration projects, or major non-attainment new source review projects, or if it's an NSPS applicability of a new source, so the new source performance standards applicability to an existing source. So those are also categories where a significant permit modification would apply. A Title I modification is considered in cases where you qualify as a modification under the new source performance standard. If you have a potential to emit increase, and it's considered a construction or reconstruction of a major source of hazardous air pollutants, that's another category. Or if maybe the potential to emit for the hazardous air pollutants increased, but it's not considered a reconstruction. However, it's now you have a new MAC that applies, and that's another category that you would have to fall into a significant permit modification. PSD sources, like we mentioned earlier, and non-attainment new source review sources, those are also significant permit modifications. If you had changes at your facility and they tripped PSD or non-attainment new source review, then those changes need to be incorporated into your Title V permit as a significant permit mod. Like I mentioned earlier, we have an electronic system through the web called the e-Business Center, and it is where you go to submit all the information about your facility, owner changes, all kinds of different notifications to us, and also I've redlined here where you would submit a Title V application, either initial, a renewal, or a modification. So in this case, if you're going to modify your Title V application and submit an application to do that, you would start by clicking what's circled here in red. All right, time for another poll. The question is, have you guys used the e-Business Center in the past?
This is our third poll. It will start in just a few seconds when it shows up on your screen, and then we'll allow a minute for the responses. Okay, more than 60% of you have responded, so thank you. If you haven't, please take a moment to respond, and we'll close the poll in just a minute.
All right.
The poll is now closed.
Thanks, Cindy. The answer to the poll is, have you used the e-Business Center in the past? 75% of you said yes. That's great. That's a efficient way of getting information in the system and to us. So it's great that you're using that system. If you haven't yet used it and you end up having to submit significant stuff to us through air permitting, it's probably a good idea to investigate it and see if it might be helpful to you. All right, and when we're talking about the significant permit modifications, what are the actual procedures that happen if you've applied for one? Obviously you submit a complete application for the changes via our air services. And the permit process goes through the 4-step process, just like a normal Title V permit. We issue a draft, preliminary, proposed, and then final. So it goes through all those processes, but the public is really only allowed to comment on the things that you are changing for this modification. So it doesn't open up the whole permit. It just opens up the part that's actually changing so that citizens can comment on that part. So once you submit that, when can you actually begin the change? Obviously your boss is beating on you, wants you to get this through so that he can make the change to the facility, to make the new product or a different product, whatever it might be. And so you always want to know, well, when can I do this? And the first question, there are kind of as 2-step questions that you answer. The first is, would the operation of the change requested be prohibited by the current Title V permit? And if the answer is no, then the operation and source can change immediately after receiving your permit to install, because your permit to install basically functions as your operating permit. But what you have to do is within that 1 year of applying for, 1 year after the PTI is issued, you have to apply for your significant permit mod in order to give us time to process that significant permit mod. So that's if the permit doesn't have anything that stops you from implementing that change. And that would typically be for something that is some kind of change for an existing facility or existing source at that time. If you look at the permit and you say, you know what, I can't do that change because it has some restriction. And so then the question is, well, we have to move on to step 2, because in this case, the permit restricts it. And step 2 basically says, well, once you make that change, can you operate the source in such a way that you would be in compliance with whatever's in your Title V permit? So for instance, you may put in a larger motor into a source and it could run faster, but maybe you can continue to run it at the lower rate in compliance with your Title V permit. So if the answer is yes, you can operate it in compliance with your Title V permit, then you can begin operating that source and operate it in compliance with your Title V permit, but not increase the production above that level until you get your significant permit modification issued final. So if you can't operate it that way, then that means you can't make the change until your significant permit mod is issued final. So the next kind of modification that I was going to mention was a minor permit modification. And as we saw in one of my earlier charts, we do a lot of these. And so there's certain kinds of situations that qualify as a minor permit modification. Number one, it can't violate an applicable requirement included in a permit to install. It can't be a Title I modification or a major modification, PTI. Like we mentioned before, those are for major or significant permit mods. It can't involve significant changes to existing monitoring, reporting, record-keeping terms. Can't require or change a case-by-case determination under some federal requirement. It can't seek to change the terms and conditions where there is no underlying applicable requirement, like some kind of emissions cap. So there are a lot of different things that don't count as a minor permit modification. And so you have to understand those to figure out whether you can use that process or not. The procedure is submit your complete application in Air Services. You suggest the changed permit language that you want. So what we want you to do is look at your permit, suggest what the terms should be for the change, and then supply that to us, preferably in a red line strikeout version, so we can just see what the changes are. The responsible official has to certify the changes qualify for a minor permit modification. The permit process is different this time. It's issued as a proposed permit and then a final permit, so just two of the steps. There's no public comment period for that. And the permittee actually can operate under the suggested terms once the application is submitted. So that's a big difference from the significant permit mod, where you have to, in a lot of cases, wait till the final permit's issued. In this case, it's minor changes. Once you submit the application, you can go ahead and operate under the revised terms. If we review it and find some problem with it, we can always terminate the operation under those terms if we find it doesn't qualify as a minor permit mod. For monitoring and record keeping and reporting for existing units, there's different ways, different modifications types that can be used when you want to make changes to the record keeping and reporting. And the administrative permit amendment is typically for increases in monitoring or reporting frequency. The minor permit mod is for insignificant changes to the monitoring, record keeping, reporting. The significant permit mod that's the tougher one, where you have significant changes to the monitoring or relaxation of reporting and record keeping. And then the report reopening is a procedure for if there is some mistake in the permit and we need to change some of the monitoring and record keeping to correct that. I want to remind people not to get caught up into thinking that the modification is just based on increased emissions and the type of modification. If you have significant changes in the terms and conditions of the permit, that also has a significant impact on the type of modification. The best thing and the thing that I go to frequently when people are saying, well, what kind of modification should I use, is to look at this guidance. We had this developed a number of years ago, looks like 2005, and it's still really good in terms of helping you quickly figure out which type of modification you need, and then understanding how long it's going to take to actually implement those changes. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and he can talk about Title V and greenhouse gases.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Mike. And this is a little bit of a carryover item from this morning concerning greenhouse gases and how they are covered under the permit program. The rules cover 6 different greenhouse gas emissions: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. The first 2 are the ones that we see the most as far as permitting goes. The others are on the unusual or rare side. One of the things that is different about this rule is that it's based on carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2e. So it's not just a straight tons for tons. For carbon dioxide, it is, but for the other pollutants, there are factors that you multiply the emissions to determine whether or not you have tripped the threshold. And as an example, methane is 21. So you take the tons of methane, multiply by 21, and that gives you the tonnage of CO2e. So when will the greenhouse gas permitting be tripped? One of the things that happened is with greenhouse gases is US EPA came out with a regulation that was, I would say, a parallel to the PSD program, where you had a certain threshold. If it was a new source above 100,000 tons of greenhouse gases, regardless of whether or not it had any other PSD pollutants, it would trip PSD for greenhouse gases by itself. One of the things that happened is that issue and the issue of permitting greenhouse gases was litigated all the way up through the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court decided was that greenhouse gas emissions could be regulated through the doorway would be the PSD program, and it would be with modifications. There would not be an independent trip of PSD and therefore Title V later associated with greenhouse gases. So the first thing is it has to be a source that trips PSD on its own and then has federally enforceable greenhouse gas emissions above 75,000 tons per year of CO2e equivalents. The best available control technology applies then once it's stripped to greenhouse gases, and we develop limits and requirements for the PSD permit that then get incorporated into the Title V permit. So one of the items that we refer to this as is it's a PSD anyway source. That's the way it gets incorporated into both the PSD program and then the Title V program. Once it's in the Title V permit, they need to continue to comply with the requirements for VACT for greenhouse gases. Right now, this only applies to sources that started off as a PSD source and then tripped PSD and had the above the threshold 75,000 tons of CO2 equivalents for a pollutant. And in most cases, it's CO2 that does that. Ohio does not regulate emissions of greenhouse gases from existing sources. That is true today. That will not be true down the road in just a little bit. We are working on a plan that is required by US EPA, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, and that will affect only large utility plants, but we are in the process of having proposed rules out, and those facilities will need to submit plans to us showing how they are going to operate efficiently. And that ultimately will end up with some sort of requirement on those facilities as to how they operate to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. But that is upcoming. That hasn't happened yet. And that's something that we're looking at towards next year. One of the things that happened was by the time US EPA got a final determination of these rules in the Clean Air Act, and in the Clean Air Act by the Supreme Court, there were a number of synthetic minor restrictions that were installed on sources so they would not trip US EPA's requirements for a major source and a major existing source for synthetic miners. For PSD. So one of the things that happened is some people ask, can they get them removed? And the answer is yes, but you have to look at the background of how those were developed, so that in the event that you were a synthetic miner for greenhouse gases and you remove that requirement, it may be that you trip PSD for a criteria pollutant. So it's important to look at the background of how that synthetic miner restriction was developed. And it may mean that it has to be modified to look at a different synthetic miner limitation to make sure you don't end up being a major source. The best bet is, if you have any questions, talk to your permit writer at the district offices or local air agencies to go over these issues. Once you make a determination that it's going to be in your interest to revise that synthetic miner, you may have to take a look at looking at, again, different limits for criteria pollutants. And you'll need to submit a modification application, and that also could be an installation permit or a Title V permit that also has to be looked at and modified potentially on how it was originally developed. Now, there's a lot of guidance out that US EPA has issued for PSD sources and greenhouse gases. And this is available both on US EPA's website and on our website. So if you have any detailed questions, you should refer to these documents. And we also have a lot of information on how to get your Title V permit. We have engineering guides that are available that provide information to the field offices and to you to take a look at about how we apply the rules and all. We have a customer support center for frequently asked questions. We have an e-business online help center, and we have Title V information also available to look at questions that we've had for Title V. Now we have one last quick poll, and this one is for the people that are in Ohio. Do you know your district office or local air agency contact?
Okay, the poll will show up on your screen in just a moment, and then we'll leave it open for about 1 minute for voting. Okay, we've just passed 50% voting, so please complete the poll and we'll close it in about 30 seconds. Poll is now closed. Thank you.
Okay, the over 80% know who the district office or local agency contact is. That is very good. They are the first person to talk to if you have any questions. They are there to help you and to provide you with information you need to meet the regulatory obligations. Also, if it turns out that you are having some difficulty with local area agency or a district office, feel free to contact either Mike or I. We are here to help you also in case there's, for some reason, some communication issue or there are some issues that doesn't seem to be resolved satisfactory. We are also here to assist you. So you can contact either of us if there is anything you want to set up a call and discuss. So here are the summary of the session today. Title V permits are the operating permits for large facilities. The Title V permits can be modified over time when changed to occur at the facility. They must be reviewed, must be renewed periodically. They are on a 5-year renewal basis. And one of the things that Mike talked about was an 18-month processing time. It is very important that you apply for your renewal on time, which is 18 months prior to expiration. That provides you with the permit shield that allows you to continue to operate in the event that you do not process the Title V permit on time. So it's real important for people to submit their Title V renewals on a timely basis. We have a lot of information available on the web associated with applying for Title Vs, and you also have the ability to look for other Title V permits and how they look and all. The whole purpose of Title V is to put everything into one document for the facility so it knows what it has to do to comply with the requirements. And some of these requirements are complex. Some of them having to do with reporting requirements and record keeping are important that the entity make sure they understand what those requirements are and apply them. So the sooner you stay in contact with Ohio EPA or the consultants that you might hire, overall that's important, and I would suggest you do that as soon as you are starting to approach the 18-month time frame. There's plenty of assistance out there, whether it is on the DAPC, Ohio EPA DAPC website, consultants, or talk with someone in your industry group that has gone through the process if you are new to the Title V business. So those are all ways in order to understand the system and make sure that you're getting a permit that is workable for your facility and you understand the requirements and you can comply with the requirements. With that, that's the end of our formal presentation. There is, as in the first session, a bonus material at the end that will be supplied, and that material focuses on compliance assurance monitoring, or CAM, that is also part of the Title V permit that we did not have time to present. So that information will be supplied to you also. So with that, we can now potentially answer some questions.
Thank you, Bob and Mike. We are now going to have the question and answer session. You can still submit questions through the question and answer pane. The first one is for Bob. Is there anything on the horizon to regulate greenhouse gases from existing non-utility sources?
No. Our focus is the utilities sector, and as I mentioned, and that's under 111D plan. We are not looking at any kind of greenhouse gas regulations for non-utility sources.
Okay, thank you. And Mike, if my potential to emit is close to 100 tons, like 98 tons, would Ohio EPA require me to go ahead and get a Title V permit because I'm close?
And the answer to that is that you would not be required to get a Title V permit, but we would advise you to try to have a little bit of a gap between the 100-ton threshold and your potential to emit. You don't want to be operating right below that threshold and have something happen at the plant that you have some excess emissions that bumps you over. So it's better to have a little bit of a gap in case something happens or you find out an emission factor was wrong or something along those lines. But if everything works out and your potential to emit is just under 100 tons, that's fine. You can avoid Title V in that case.
Okay, thank you. And another one for Mike. As a new source, if my potential to emit is greater than 100 tons, do I need to apply for a Title V permit, receive that permit, and then apply for a synthetic minor or FESOP permit?
So typically, if you are a new source and you have to get an installation permit first, at that point, we would figure out whether or not you are going to end up being a Title V facility or not. And we would put any necessary terms and conditions in the permit if you choose to avoid Title V. And so you would get that in your installation permit, which in that case would also function as your operating permit. So you wouldn't end up having to be a Title V facility. So all of that would be figured out when you're working on the installation permit. And if you figure out, well, you're just going to be Title V, then we process the installation permit. You get the installation permit and you have a year to apply for your Title V at that point. So your installation permit functions as your operating permit for that first year.
Okay. And the last question, if you receive comments during the public comment period, is it going to delay the issuance of the permit?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is it depends on the significance of the comments and how many we get. We often get comments for various permits that, especially from the company, that don't have any significant impact on the time it takes us to process the permit. But if we issue a permit for a controversial source where we have a couple hundred people show up for a hearing and we get bunches of comments, then it's going to take us a while to work through those. And it can significantly add to the time that it takes us to do that process and get the final permit issued.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank Bob and Mike and also Tim and Ben for answering the questions and the OCAP staff for taking care of everything behind the scenes for air permitting for major sources part 2. There are additional sessions that will take place later this or next week, and you still have time to register for those sessions. And if you have any questions, please contact the APC staff at any time. Mike Hopkins and Bob Hodenbosey's email addresses are on the slide on your screen. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you could complete it and provide us with your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to the recording of today's webinar, a certificate of attendance, and another link to the survey if you did not have a chance to complete it. So with that, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you can participate in more of Ohio EPA's Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. Thank you for attending and have a great day.